Fourth book of Maccabees, chapter 2:39. For most excellent is the meat of this animal, which nature has graciously bestowed upon us, and why should you abominate it? Truly it is folly not to enjoy innocent pleasures, and it is wrong to reject nature's favors, but it will still be greater folly, I think, on your part, if with idle vaporing about truth you shall proceed to defy even me to your own punishment. Will you not awake from your preposterous philosophy? Will you not fling aside the nonsense of your calculations, and, adopting another frame of mind befitting your mature years, learn the true philosophy of expediency, and bow to my charitable counsel, and have pity on your own venerable age? For consider this too, that even if there be some power whose eye is upon this religion of yours, he will always pardon you for a transgression done under compulsion. This urged by the tyrant to the unlawful eating of unclean meat, Eleazar asked permission to speak, and receiving it, he began his speech before the court as follows: We, O Antiochus, having accepted the divine law as the law of our country, do not believe any stronger necessity is laid upon us than that our obedience to the law. Therefore, we do surely deem it right, not in any way whatsoever to transgress the law, and yet were our law, as you suggest, not truly divine, while we vainly believed it to be divine, not even so would it be right for us to destroy our reputation for piety. Think it not, then, a small sin for us to eat the unclean thing, for the transgression of the law, be it in small things or in great, is equally heinous, for in either case equally the law is despised. And you scoff at our philosophy, as if under it we were living in a manner contrary to reason. Not so, for the law teaches us self-control, so that we are masters of all our pleasures and desires, and are thoroughly trained in manliness, so as to endure all pain with readiness. And it teaches us justice, so that with all our various dispositions we act fairly, and it teaches righteousness, so that with due reverence we worship only the God who is, and therefore do we eat no unclean meat. For believing our law to be given by God, we know also that the Creator of the world, as the lawgiver, feels for us according to our nature. He has commanded us to eat the things that will be convenient for our souls, and has forbidden us to eat meats that would be to the contrary. But it is the act of a tyrant that you should compel us not only to transgress the law, but should also make us eat in such manner as you may mock at this defilement, so utterly abominable to us. Why not just have authentic behavior? That's the whole thing about forcing people into stuff like this. You're probably going to have more authentic behavior if you don't, But you shall not mock at me thus, neither will I break the sacred oaths of my ancestors to keep the law, nor even though you tear out mine eyes and burn out my entrails. Well, the oaths of your ancestors to be upon particular ethics aren't yours. So, yeah. Unless you want them to be, of course. I am not so unmanned by old age, but that, when righteousness is at stake, the strength of youth returns to my reason. So, twist hard your racks, and blow your furnace harder. I do not pity mine own age, as to break the law of my fathers in mine own person. I will not belie thee, O law, that was my teacher. I will not desert thee, O beloved self-control. I will not put thee to shame, O wisdom-loving reason. Nor will I deny thee, O venerated priesthood, and knowledge of the law. Neither shalt thou sully the pure mouth of mine old age, and my lifelong constancy to the law. Clean shall my fathers receive me, unafraid of thy torments, even to the death. For thou indeed mayest be tyrant over unrighteous men, but thou shalt not lord it over my resolution in the matter of righteousness, either by thy words or through thy deeds. Chapter 3, Eleazar, the gentle-spirited old man, shows such fortitude that even as we read these words 2,000 years later, they seem like an inextinguishable fire. 22 verses. But when Eleazar replied thus eloquently to the exhortations of the tyrants, the guards around him dragged him roughly to the torturing place. At first, they unclothed the old man, who was adorned with the beauty of holiness, Then, binding his arms on either side, they scourged him as a herald standing and shouting out over against him, "Obey the orders of the king!" But the great-souled and noble man, and Eleazar, in very truth, was no more moved in his mind than if he were being tormented in a dream. Yea, the old man, keeping his eyes steadfastly raised to heaven, suffered his flesh to be torn by the scourges till he was bathed in blood, and his sides became a mass of wounds. And even when he fell to the ground because his body could no longer support the pain, he still kept his reason erect and inflexible. With his foot, then one of the cruel guards, as he fell, kicked him savagely in the side to make him get up. With his foot, then one of the cruel guards, as he fell, kicked him. But he endured the anguish and despised the compulsion, and bore up under the torments. And like a brave athlete taking punishment, the old man outwore his tormentors. The sweat stood on his brow, and he drew his breath in hard gasps, till his nobility of soul extorted the admiration of his tormentors themselves. Hereupon, partly in pity for his old age, partly in sympathy for their friend, partly in admiration for his courage, some of the courtiers of the king went up to him and said, "Why, O Eleazar, dost thou madly destroy thyself in this misery? We will bring to thee of the seethed meats, but do thou feign only to partake of the swine's flesh, and so save thyself." And Eleazar, as if their counsel did but add to his tortures, cried loudly, "No! May we, sons of Abraham, never have so evil of thought, as with faint heart, to counterfeit a part unseemly to us. Contrary to reason, indeed, were it for us, after living unto the truth till old age, and guarding it lawful guise, the repute of so living, now to change and become in our own persons a pattern to the young of impiety, to the end that we should encourage them to eat unclean meat. Shame were it if we should live on a little longer, during that little being mocked of all men for cowardice, and while despised by the tyrant, as unmanly should fail to defend the divine law unto death. Therefore, O sons of Abraham, do you die nobly for righteousness' sake? But as for you, O minions of the tyrant, why pause ye in your work? So they, seeing him thus, triumphant over the tortures and moved even by the pity of his executioners, dragged him to the fire. There they cast him on it, burning him with cruelly cunning devices. And they poured broth of the evil odor into his nostrils. And when the fire already reached into his bones and was about to give up the ghost, he lifted up his eyes to God and said, "Thou, O God, knowest that though I might save myself while I am dying by fiery torments for thy law, be merciful unto thy people, and let our punishment be a satisfaction in their behalf. Make my blood and their purification, and take my soul to ransom for their souls." And with these words the holy man nobly yielded up his spirit under the torture, and for the sake of the law held out by his reason, and even against the torments unto death. Beyond question, then, the inspired reason is master over the passions, for if his passions or sufferings had prevailed over his reason, we should have credited them with this evidence of their superior power. But now his reason, having conquered his passions, we properly attribute to it the power of commanding them, and it is right that we should admit that the mastery lies with reason, in cases at least where it conquers pains that come from the outside ourselves, for it were ridiculous to deny it, and my proof covers not only the superiority of reason to pains, but its superiority to pleasures also. Neither does it surrender to them. Chapter 4. This so-called age of reason may in this chapter read that the philosophy of reason is 2,000 years old, the story of 7 sons and their mother, 40 verses. For the reason of our father, Eleazar, like a fine steersman steering the ship of sanctity on the sea of the passions, though buffeted by threats of the tyrant, swept by the swelling waves of the tortures, never shifted for one moment the helm of sanctity till he sailed into the haven of victory over death. Now, if you're so forced or even or coerced to such a degree, not social pressure, but whatever, I would say, in accordance with what I believe, and I've pointed out why elsewhere, that the blame for people being forced into these things is on those who are doing the violence and such, not the people who are forced to save their life or their body or their being or something like that. If it's just popularity or something like that, no, you can't. That's not an excuse. But a higher station, of course, would be the martyr. I'm not disputing that. No city besieged with many and cunning engines ever defended itself so well as did that holy man when his sacred soul was attacked with scourge and rack and flame. And he moved them who were laying siege to his soul through his reason that he was the shield of sanctity. For our father Eleazar, setting his mind firm as beetling sea cliff, as a beetling sea cliff, broke the mad onset of the scourges of the passions. O priest, worthy of thy priesthood, thou didst not defile thy holy teeth, nor didst thou befoul with unclean meat thy belly, that had room only for piety and purity. O confessor of the law and philosopher of the divine life, such should those be whose office it is to serve the law and defend it with their own blood and honorable sweat in the face of sufferings to the death. Thou, O Father, didst fortify our fidelity to the law through thy steadfastness unto glory, and having spoken in honor of his holiness, thou didst not belie thy speech, and didst confirm thy words, a divine philosophy, by thy deeds. O aged man, thou wast more forceful than the tortures. O reverend elder, that wast tenser strung than the flame. Thou great king over the passions, Eleazar. For as our father Aaron, armed with the censer, ran through the massed congregation against the fiery angel and overcame him, so the son of Aaron, Eleazar, being consumed by the melting heat of the fire, remained unshaken by his reason. And yet most wonderful of all, he, being an old man, with the sinews of his body unstrung, and his muscles relaxed, and his nerves weakened, grew a young man again in the spirit of his reason, and with Isaac-like reason turned the hydra-headed torture to impotence. O blessed age! O reverend gray head! O reverend gray head! O life of the faithful to the law, and the perfected by the seal of death! Assuredly then, if an old man despise the torments unto death for righteousness' sake, it must be admitted that inspired reason is able to guide the passions. But some perhaps may answer that not all men are masters of the passions, because not all men have the reason enlightened, but as many as, with their whole heart, make righteousness their first thought, these alone are able to master the weakness of the flesh, believing that unto God they die not, as our patriarchs Abraham and Isaac and Jacob died not, but as they live unto God. Therefore, there is nothing contradictory in certain persons appearing to be slaves to passions in consequence of the weakness of the reason. For who is there that being a philosopher followed righteously the whole rule of philosophy, and having put his trust in God, and knowing that it is a blessed thing to endure all hardness for the sake of virtue, would not conquer his passions for the sake of righteousness? For the wise and self-controlled man alone is the brave ruler of the passions. Yea, by this means even young boys, being philosophers by virtue of the reason which is according to righteousness, have triumphed over yet more grievous tortures. And when the tyrant found himself notably defeated in his first attempt, and impotent to compel an old man to eat unclean meat, then true in violent rage he ordered the guards to bring others of the young men of the Hebrews, and if they would eat unclean meat, to release them after eating it, but if they refused, to torture them yet more savagely. Under these orders of the tyrant, 7 brothers, together with their aged mother, were brought prisoners before him, and all handsome and modest, and well-born, and generally attractive. Now, these rules weren't completely arbitrary. It wasn't like, well, you could eat a sheep but not a goat, or a goat and not a sheep, and you can eat or more obvious would be like one color sheep versus another color sheep or something. But under orders of the tyrant, 7 brothers, together with their aged mother, were brought prisoners before him, all handsome, all modest, and well-born, and generally attractive. That reminds of the Daniel story, doesn't it? Okay, verse 20. And when the tyrant saw them there, standing as if they were a festal choir, with their mother in the midst, he took notice of them, and struck by their noble and distinguished bearing, he smiled at them, and calling them nearer, said, O young men, I wish well to each of you, and admire your beauty, and honor highly so large a band of brothers. So not only do I advise you not to persist in the madness that old man who has already suffered, but I even entreat you to yield to me and become partakers of my friendship. For, as I am able to punish those who disobey my orders, so I am able to advance those who do obey me. Be assured, then, that you shall be given positions of importance and authority in my service if you will reject the ancestral law of your polity, share in the Hellenic life, and walk in a new way, and take some pleasure in your youth. For if you drive me to anger with your disobedience, you will compel me to resort to terrible penalties, and put every single one of you to death by torture. Have pity then on yourselves, whom even I, your opponent, pity for your youth and your beauty. Will you not consider with yourselves this thing, that if you disobey me, there is nothing before you but death and torments? But with these words he ordered the instruments of torture to be brought forward in order to persuade them by fear to eat unclean meat. But when the guards had produced wheels and joint dislocators and racks and bone crushers and catapults and cauldrons and braziers and thumbscrews and iron claws and wedges and branding irons, the tyrant spoke again and said, You had better feel fear, my lads, and the justice you worship will pardon your unwilling transgression. But they, hearing his persuasions and seeing his dreadful engines, not only showed no fear, but actually arrayed their philosophy in opposition to the tyrant, and by their right reason did abase his tyranny. And yet consider, supposing some amongst them to have been faint-hearted and cowardly, what sort of language would they have used? Would it not have been to this effect, Alas, miserable creatures, that we are and foolish above measure. When the king invites us and appeals to us on terms of kind treatment, shall we not obey him? Why do we encourage ourselves with vain desires and dare a disobedience that is to cost us our lives? Shall we not, O men, my brothers, fear the dread instruments, and weigh well his threats of the tortures, and abandon these empty vaunts and this fatal breaking? Let us take pity on our own youth, and have compassion on our mother's age, and let us lay to heart that if we disobey, we shall die, and even the divine justice shall have mercy on us, if compelled by necessity we yield to the king in fear. Why should we cast away from ourselves this dear life, and rob ourselves of this sweet world? Let us not strive against necessity, nor with vain confidence invite our torture. Even the law itself does not willingly condemn us to death, we being in terror of the instruments of torture. Why does such contentiousness inflame us with fatal obstinacy, find favor with us, when we might have a peaceful life by obeying the king? But no such words escaped these young men at the prospect of the torture, nor did such thoughts enter into their minds, for they were despisers of the passions and masters over pain. Chapter 5, a chapter of horror and torture, revealing ancient tyranny at its utmost savagery. Verse 26 is profound truth, and this is 60 verses. And thus no sooner did the tyrant conclude his urging of them to eat unclean meat, than all with one voice together, and as with one soul, said to him, Why dost thou delay, O tyrant? We are ready to die rather than transgress the commandments of our fathers. For we should be putting our ancestors also to shame if we did not walk in obedience to the law, and take Moses as our counselor. O tyrant that counselest us to transgress the law, do not, hating us, pity us beyond ourselves. For we esteem thy mercy, giving us our life in return for a breach of the law, a thing harder to bear than death itself. Thou wouldst terrify us with thy threats of death under torture, as if a little while ago thou hadst learned nothing from Eleazar. But if the old man of the Hebrews endured the tortures for righteousness' sake, yea, until they died, more befittingly will we young men die, despising the torments of thy compulsion, over which he, our aged teacher, also triumphed. Make trial, therefore, O tyrant, and if thou takest our lives for the sake of righteousness, think not that thou hurtest us with thy tortures, for we, through our evil treatment, and our endurance of it, shall win the prize of virtue. But thou, for our cruel murder, shalt suffer at the hands of divine justice sufficient torment by fire forever. These words of the youths redoubled the wrath of the tyrant, not at their disobedience only, but at what he considered their ingratitude. So by his orders the scourgers brought forward the eldest of them and stripped them of his garment, and bound his hands and armed on either side with thongs. But when those pincher things you grab things with, but when they had scourged him till they were weary and gained nothing thereby, they cast him upon the wheel, and on it the noble youth was racked till his bones were out of joint. And as joint after joint gave way, he denounced the tyrant in these words: O thou most abominable tyrant, thou enemy of the justice of heaven, and bloody-minded, thou didst torment me in the fashion not for slaying, nor for impiety, but for defending the law of God. And when the guards said to him, Consent to eat, so that you may be released from your tortures, he said to them, Your methods, O miserable minions, is not strong enough to lead captive my reason. Cut off my limbs, and burn my flesh, and twist my joints. Through all the torments will I show you that in behalf of virtue the sons of the Hebrews alone are unconquerable. And as he thus spake, they set hot coals upon him besides, and intensifying the tortures, strained him yet tighter on the wheel. And all on the wheel was besmeared with his blood, and the heaped coals were quenched by the humors of his body, dropping down, and the rent flesh ran down the axles of the machine. And with his bodily frame already in dissolution, the great-souled youth, like a true son of Abraham, groaned not at all, but as if he were suffering a change by fire to incorruption, he nobly endured the torment, saying, Follow my example, O brothers. Do not forever desert me, and forswear not our brotherhood in nobility of soul. War a holy and honorable warfare on behalf of righteousness, through which may the just providence that watched over our fathers be merciful unto his people, and take vengeance on the accursed tyrant. Now, there are certain conditions where it's against external, but the spiritual warfare, for the most part, is to continue to do what's right and believe what's right and find out more of the truth and that sort of thing, and encourage it in others. And with these words, the holy youth yielded up the ghost. But while all were wondering at his constancy of soul, the guards brought forward the second in age of the sons, and grappling him with sharp-clawed hands of iron, they fastened him to the engines and the catapult. But when they heard his noble resolve in answer to their question, would he eat rather than be tortured, these panther-like beasts tore at his sinews with claws of iron, and rent away all the flesh from his cheeks, and tore off the skin from his head. But he steadfastly enduring this agony said, How sweet is every form of death for the sake of the righteousness of our fathers. And to this tyrant he saith, O ruthless of tyrants, doth it not seem to thee that at this moment thou thyself sufferest tortures worse than mine, in seeing thy tyranny's arrogant intention overcome by my endurance for righteousness' sake? For I am supported under pain by the joys that come through virtue, whereas thou art in torment whilst glorying in thy impiety. Neither shalt thou escape, O most abominable tyrant, the penalties of the divine wrath. And when he had bravely met his glorious death, the third son was brought forward, and was earnestly entreated by many to taste, and so to save himself. But he answered in a loud voice, Are ye ignorant that the same Father begat me and my brothers that are dead, and that same mother gave us birth, and in the same doctrines was I brought up? I do not forswear the noble bond of brotherhood. Therefore, if ye have any engine of torment, apply it to this body of mine. For my soul ye cannot reach, not if ye would. But if they were greatly angered at the bold speech of the man, and they dislocated his hands and his feet with their dislocating engine, and wrenched his limbs out of their sockets, and unstrung them, and they twisted round his fingers, and his arms, and his legs, and his elbow joints. And in no wise being able to strangle his spirit, they stripped off his skin, taking the points of the fingers with it, and tore in Scythian fashion, the Hyperboreans, Gog and Magog, Juj wa Majuj, and Sakas, a bunch of terms, right? The scalp, the steppes of Eurasia, the scalp from his head, and straightway brought him to the wheel. And on this they twisted his spine till he saw his own flesh hanging in strips, and great gouts of blood pouring from his entrails. And at the point of death he said, We, O most abominable tyrant, suffer thus for our upbringing and our virtue that are of God. But thou, for thy impiety and cruelty, shalt endure torments without end. And when this man had died worthily of his brothers, they brought up the fourth and said to him, Be not thou also mad with the same madness as thy brethren, but obey the king and save thyself. But he said unto them, For me ye have no fire so exceeding hot as to make me a coward. By the blessed death of my brethren, by the eternal doom of the tyrant, and by the glorious life of the righteous, I will not deny my noble brotherhood. Invent tortures, O tyrant, in order that thou mayest learn thereby that I am brother of those who have been already tortured. When he had heard this, the bloodthirsty, murderous, and utterly abominable Antiochus bade them cut out his tongue. But he said, Even if thou dost remove my organ of speech, God is a hearer also of the speechless. Lo, I put out my tongue, ready, cut it out, for thou shalt not thereby silence my reason. Gladly do we give our bodily members to be mutilated for the cause of God, but God will speedily pursue after thee. For thou cuttest out the tongue that sang songs of praise unto him. But when this man also was put to a death of agony with the tortures, the fifth sprang forward, saying, I shrink not, O tyrant, from demanding the torture for virtue's sake. Yea, of myself I come forward in order that, slaying me also, thou mayest, by yet more misdeeds, increase the penalty thou owest to the justice of heaven, O enemy of virtue and enemy of man. For what crime dost thou destroy us in this way? Does it seem evil to thee that we worship the Creator and all and live in accordance with his virtuous law? But these things are worthy of honors, not of tortures, if thou didst understand human aspirations and hadst hope of salvation before God. Lo, now thou art God's enemy, and makest war on those that worship God. As he spake thus, and the guards bound him, and brought him before the catapult, and they tied him thereto on his knees, and fastening them there with iron clamps, they wrenched his loins over the rolling wedge, so that he was completely curled back like a scorpion, and every joint was disjointed. And thus in grievous strait for breath and anguish of body, he exclaimed, Glorious, O tyrant, glorious against thy will, are the boons that thou bestowest on me, enabling me to show my fidelity to the law through yet more honorable tortures. And when this man also was dead, the sixth was brought, a mere boy, who, in answer to the tyrant's inquiry whether he was willing to eat and be released, said, I am not so old in years as my brethren, but I am as old in mind. For we were born and reared for the same purpose, and are equally bound also to die for the same cause. So if thou choosest to torture us for not eating unclean meat, torture. And he spake these words. As he spake these words, they brought him to the wheel, and with care they stretched him out, and dislocated the bones of his back, and set fire under him. And they made sharp skewers red hot, and ran them into his back, and piercing through his sides, they burned away his entrails also. But he, in the midst of his tortures, exclaimed, O contest worthy of saints, wherein so many of us, brethren, in the cause of righteousness, have been entered for a competition in torments, and have not been conquered. For the righteous understanding, O tyrant, is unconquerable. In the armor of virtue I go to join my brothers in death, and to add in myself one stronger avenger to punish thee, O deviser of the tortures and enemy of the truly righteous. We 6 youths have overthrown thy tyranny, for is not thine impotence to alter our reason, or force us to eat unclean meat, and overthrow for thee? Thy fire is cool for us, thy engines of torture torment not, and thy violence is impotent. For the guards have been officers for us, and not of a tyrant, but of the divine law, and therefore we have our reason yet unconquered. Chapter 6, Brotherly Bonds and a Mother's Love. 46 verses, and we have Ahikar answers Pharaoh's riddle as the illustration that's going to appear in the middle of this chapter. Remember, the Maccabees is whom under historical Judaism appeared as in terms of the name. Now, something that could be called Judaism can be traced to 540 BCE, and that's a longer discussion for elsewhere, but, because obviously at this point, they're not being led by prophets, they're being led by the scholars and the interpretations as the years go by, and they don't want to dishonor the interpretations of their ancestors. And which is honorable enough, but not as honorable as the other. And when this one also died, a blessed death, being cast into the cauldron, the seventh son, the youngest of them all, came forward. But the tyrant, although fiercely exasperated by his brethren, felt pity for the boy, and seeing him there, already bound, he had him brought near, and sought to persuade him, saying, Thou seest the end of the folly of thy brethren, for through their disobedience they have been racked to death. Thou too, if thou didst not obey, wilt thyself also be miserably tortured and put to death before thy time. But if thou dost obey, thou shalt be my friend, and thou shalt be advanced to high office in that business of the kingdom. And while thus appealing to him, he sent for the boy's mother, in order that her sorrow for the loss of so many sons, she might urge the survivor to obey and be saved. But the mother, speaking in the Hebrew tongue, it was called Aramea during this time, but as I shall tell later on, encouraging the boy, and he said to the guards, Loose me, that I may speak to the king, and to all his friends with him. And they, rejoicing at the boy's request, made haste to loose him. And running up to the red-hot brazier, O impious tyrant, he cried, and most ungodly of all sinners, art thou not ashamed to take thy blessings and thy kingship at the hands of God, and to slay his servants and torture the followers of righteousness? For which things the divine justice delivers thee into a more rapid and an eternal fire, and torments which shall not leave hold on thee to all eternity. Art thou not ashamed, being a man, O wretch, with the heart of a wild beast, to take men of like feelings with thyself, made from the same elements, and tear out their tongues, and scourge and torture them in this manner?